Jordan stood in my stone workshop, using a 100-year-old heirloom chisel to pry open a can of cheap primer. When I told him to show some respect, he looked me in the eye and said, "You're just a glorified warehouse keeper, Nicholas. This legacy needs a modern brain, so stop acting like you matter here." My wife, Amanda, didn't defend me. She simply said, "He's just a boy, don't be so rigid." I smiled. I was about to show them what happens when you mistake a man's patience for his permission. In a moment where your life's work is insulted in your own home, would you have chosen to stay quiet for the sake of a fragile peace, or would you have ended the silence right then and there? Winter in Maine has a way of exposing every crack. For 3 decades, this workshop was a place of mathematical certainty, a sanctuary where granite and marble obeyed my hands. But after my first wife, Sarah, passed away 6 years ago, the house and the workshop became a tomb of silence. The mornings were long, and the afternoons were longer. I kept turning my head every time a car pulled into the driveway, expecting a ghost to walk through the door. Then came Amanda. She appeared 8 months ago, like a sudden break in a nor'easter. She was attentive and warm, and she listened when I talked about the intricacies of stone restoration without checking her watch. In my loneliness, I let myself hope. I let myself believe that finding companionship at 62 was a stroke of luck rather than a strategic vulnerability. Looking back now, I realize that affection in the autumn of your life is often a heavy fog. It causes you to confuse the basic human need for presence with a moral obligation to underwrite the failures of others. Jordan was part of the package. He was 28, dressed in labels I could not pronounce, and possessed an ego that far outpaced his actual skill set. At first, the requests were small: a $300 emergency here, a textbook payment there. But temporary support has a habit of becoming a permanent entitlement. Within 6 months, I had cleared nearly $30,000 of his credit card debt, accumulated from what he called essential market research for his influencer lifestyle. I had become the silent investor in their version of family, footing the bill for a performance that was starting to cost more than I was willing to lose. I did not argue. In my profession, you do not scream at a block of stone when you find a fault line. You observe it, you map it, you wait to see exactly how deep it goes before you decide how to cut. My silence was not a sign that I was being bullied. It was the clinical patience of an engineer performing a structural audit on my own life. We were planning the 100th anniversary of the Henderson Stone Works. I wanted a warm night to celebrate the legacy my grandfather started. I wanted proof that the cracks I was seeing in my marriage could still be filled with mortar and grace. But as the date approached, the tension in the air grew as thin as a sheet of slate. The 100th anniversary dinner was designed to project absolute strength. I had invited my top 3 commercial partners and the state's head of historic preservation men, who valued the permanence of stone as much as I did. The table was set with heavy linen and the weight of a century of honest labour. I wanted to believe that if I could just perform the role of a happy patriarch, the reality would follow suit. But as the 3rd course was served, Jordan decided to seize the stage. He stood up, phone in hand, and began to critique the very business that was currently feeding him. He looked at our guests and said, "Nicholas is a master of the old ways, but this workshop needs a modern soul. We can't keep living in the past if we want a future." The room went quiet, the kind of silence that usually precedes a structural collapse. I looked at Amanda, waiting for the woman who claimed to love me to stand by my side. Instead, she leaned in and whispered loud enough for the table to hear, "He's just trying to help your outdated shop, Nicholas. Don't be so sensitive." In that moment, the temperature in the room dropped 10 degrees. I felt a familiar coldness, not from the main air, but from the realization that I was being treated as a relic in my own home. Looking back now, I realized that I was a victim of the invisible chain of the survivor. After losing Sarah, I was so desperate to avoid the void that I allowed Amanda and Jordan to move in and treat my life like a garage sale. I had convinced myself that their noise was better than the silence, not realizing that I was essentially paying for my own public humiliation. It took me years to understand that some forms of tolerance are actually a slow-motion surrender. I was the survivor of my first marriage's end, and in my fear of returning to that isolation, I had allowed these parasites to believe that my kindness was an open-ended line of credit. I watched them exchange a look of smugness, convinced that I was too broken to fight back. The dinner continued, but the air was dead. Every clink of silverware felt like a hammer hitting a chisel on a flawed piece of marble. Jordan spent the rest of the night discussing skimming overhead costs and modernizing our sourcing, as if 3 generations of reputation could be replaced by a few clever spreadsheet maneuvers. I sat there, smiling, listening to him describe the destruction of my legacy as if it were a business plan. I didn't correct him. I didn't raise my voice. I simply began to perform a mental inventory of every legal and financial connection we shared. The cracks were no longer just surface level, they reached the foundation, and I knew exactly which stone I needed to pull to bring the whole house down on their heads. I didn't sleep at all that night. Instead, I sat in my darkened office at 3 a.m., staring at the digital ledger of the State Capital Preservation Project. In my trade, precision is everything. A single millimetre of error can cause a 10-ton archway to collapse. I applied that same mechanical scrutiny to Jordan's recent procurement orders. I found the discrepancy within 40 minutes. He had been substituting high-grade Vermont granite with a cheap, porous composite from an uncertified supplier, pocketing the difference. The skimming amounted to exactly $150,000. If I'm being honest, I felt a strange sense of academic satisfaction. At the time, I didn't realize how deep the rot had truly gone, but the data provided a cold clarity that emotion never could. I looked at the scanned delivery receipts and saw my own name scrawled at the bottom. It was a clumsy forgery, but to a state auditor, it would look like I was the one cutting corners. He wasn't just stealing my money, he was auctioning off my professional reputation to the lowest bidder. I sat back and thought about the trap of normalized cruelty that had been set in my own home. I realized then that Jordan and Amanda had begun to view my patience as a standard operating procedure, a duty I owed them. In their eyes, my restraint wasn't a choice. It was a character flaw they were entitled to exploit. This is the mechanism of the parasite. They treat your boundaries as an act of aggression and your tolerance as a mandatory subscription. By making their disrespect normal, they had effectively anesthetized me against my own survival instincts. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was a breach of professional contract on a foundational level. If the state inspectors found that composite stone in a historic landmark, Henderson Stoneworks would be stripped of its license and sued into oblivion. 3 generations of sweat and dust would be erased by a 28-year-old boy who thought a gold watch was more important than structural integrity. Looking back now, I see that Jordan's greatest mistake was assuming that because I didn't raise my voice, I wasn't listening. He had confused my silence for a lack of weapons. I reached into my desk and pulled out the trademark registration for Stone Truth, the intellectual property that held the rights to every restoration technique we owned. I didn't call the police, and I didn't wake Amanda to demand an explanation. I simply opened a new encrypted file and began to download every forged signature and fraudulent invoice. Jordan thought he was occupying a kingdom. He didn't realize he was walking into a vault. The deeper truth appeared at 4:15 a.m. in the form of a handwritten letter tucked inside a file Amanda had asked me to store for her. She told me they were personal papers too painful to look at after her previous marriage ended. I had respected that privacy. But when you find a $150,000 hole in your business, you stop honoring the etiquette of a false partnership. I opened the envelope and found her instructions to Jordan. She hadn't just known about the skimming. She was the architect. The letter outlined exactly how to hide the paper trail in the accounting software and assured him that if I ever found out, I would simply pay the debt to avoid the scandal of a public divorce. She wrote, "Nicholas is old and lonely. He won't let us go back to the street over a few numbers." It was a chilling realization. Looking back now, I see that I wasn't just a husband to her. I was an exit strategy. I was the infrastructure they intended to use until they could build their own out of my ruins. At that point, I realized that some forms of dependence stay invisible until you stop cooperating. I was the silent foundation of their luxury, and they were already planning how to replace the cornerstone. If I'm being honest, I felt more clinical than angry. Anger is a variable. Accounting is a constant. I called my lawyer, Robert, at 5 a.m. I didn't sound like a man whose heart was broken. I sounded like a man who was executing a contingency plan. "Robert," I said, "it's time to file the papers. Execute the secondary trust." You see, a master stonemason never builds without a failsafe. After Sarah died, I had quietly set up an ironclad trust to protect the Henderson legacy, holding the rights to all my intellectual property and the Stone Truth brand. The documents had been signed and held in escrow for years, just waiting for my word. Robert didn't need to draft anything new. He just needed to hit send to the state registry when the office opened. By the time Jordan and Amanda came down for breakfast, they were already living in a legal shell. They still had the house, the cars, and the workshop floor, but the actual value, the soul of the work, was now legally unreachable. Robert warned me that the state audit for the preservation project would still be a hurdle, but with the evidence of forgery we had compiled, the liability would shift directly to Jordan. I realized that my kindness had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years. Now, the account was closed. I didn't confront them when they came down for breakfast. I watched Amanda pour her coffee and ask about my day, her face a masterpiece of concerned affection. I realized then that some predators don't have teeth. They have soft voices and high-status demands. I let her believe the game was still in her favor. I needed them to feel secure enough to make their final mistake. I told Jordan we were holding a special meeting at the workshop the next morning to announce the firm's new leadership. He beamed, already practicing his winner's speech in the polished granite of the backsplash. "I have learned that the loudest sound in the world is the silence right before a man pulls the pin on his own grenade. I had spent the previous afternoon making quiet phone calls. I explicitly invited the state inspectors to the workshop under the strict guise of an emergency material audit for the capital project. Jordan, however, saw their RSVP and mistook it for an audience. He thought they were coming to witness his coronation. The workshop was packed for Jordan's anticipated coronation. He had spent the morning adjusting his tie in the reflection of a polished granite slab, his phone already mounted on a tripod, to live stream what he called the passing of the torch. He looked at his followers and spoke about disrupting an archaic industry, while Amanda stood by his side, her hand resting on his shoulder with the proprietary pride of a queen mother. I stood at the back, near the heavy steel saw, watching the digital numbers of his viewer count climb into the thousands. I stepped to the podium, looking directly at the state officials who were holding their clipboards, expecting a routine audit. I turned to Jordan's camera and then back to the room. "Gentlemen," I said to the inspectors, "thank you for coming. You are here to inspect the integrity of the stone for the state capitol. Please, look at the screen." Jordan's smirk was wide and oily until the first slide appeared. It wasn't a transition of power. It was a forensic autopsy of his greed. I displayed the side-by-side chemical analysis of the porous, low-grade stone he had installed at the state capitol versus the architectural-grade granite the contract required. Then, I projected the delivery receipts with my forged signature, followed by our company's own financial ledger, showing the $150,000 difference being funneled directly into a dummy LLC registered in Jordan's name. The silence that followed was different from the dinner party. This one had the weight of a legal indictment. Looking at him then, I realized the psychological trap of the empty wallet. Jordan had built an entire persona on a status that was leased from my reputation. This is a common pattern among those who mistake proximity to wealth for the possession of character. They believe that because they use the tools of a master, they have inherited his hands. His power was a thin veneer of borrowed prestige, and the moment the underlying support was removed, the entire structure collapsed into dust. Jordan's reaction was exactly what his mother's letter had predicted. He didn't apologize. He attacked. He forgot about the live stream, forgot about the state officials in the front row, and began to scream that I was an obsolete dinosaur who was sabotaging the only talent the family had. His followers watched in real time as his polished influencer mask cracked, revealing a frantic, entitled boy who couldn't account for the numbers. Amanda didn't weep or confess. She turned to me with a cold, calculating fury and said, "You've destroyed your own family for a few pieces of rock." I looked at her, then at the two state inspectors, who were already stepping forward to take Jordan's statement. "I didn't destroy a family, Amanda," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the room. "I simply stopped allowing a parasitic lie to live in a house built on the truth." Jordan's mouth opened and closed, as he realized his own live stream had just broadcasted his professional suicide to the very industry he hoped to lead. Justice is rarely a sudden lightning strike. It is more like the slow, pressurized formation of a mineral deposit, a process that takes time, grit, and the cold weight of reality. The 6 months following that announcement were a grueling audit of every contract I had signed since the wedding. I spent my days in sterile conference rooms with Robert and state officials, providing the digital trail that Jordan assumed I was too old to find. Jordan's fate was finalized in a wood-paneled courtroom where his influencer charms had no currency. He was sentenced to 5 years of probation for fraud and forgery. More importantly, for the family legacy, the state board permanently banned him from participating in any public or commercial building projects, effectively exiling him from the industry he tried to exploit. He was ordered to pay full restitution of the $150,000 he had skimmed, a debt that will anchor him to his own failure for the next decade. Looking back now, I realize that some people only understand the value of a name when they are no longer allowed to use it. Amanda's departure was a clinical affair. Once she realized the secondary trust had placed Henderson Legacy behind an iron wall, her concerned affection evaporated. She signed the separation agreement without a single tear, her eyes finally reflecting the cold calculation I had documented in her own letter. She left Maine in the middle of a Tuesday, taking only the designer clothes my credit cards had bought her. If I'm being honest, the silence she left behind was different than the one after Sarah died. This silence was clean. The workshop was saved, but the cost was a permanent fracture in my personal life. At the time, I didn't realize that some forms of loss are actually a profitable liquidation. I had traded a fraudulent marriage for my professional integrity, and as I stood in the empty office, I felt the return of my own status. I had saved the stone truth from a parasitic lie, proving that while stone can be cracked, a foundation built on precision and honesty is very hard to move. I learned that the sweetest part of justice isn't watching others suffer. It is the quiet, earned realization that you are still standing exactly where you are meant to be. I established the Stone Truth Foundation for young craftsmen. It wasn't a PR move to fix a bruised image, but a necessary investment in the only currency that doesn't devalue integrity. I didn't wait for Jordan's court-ordered restitution to trickle in $10 at a time. I funded the academy with my own capital, an investment for kids who grew up like I did, silent, hard-working, and often overlooked. We teach them how to restore the historic architecture of Maine, but more importantly, we teach them that a structure is only as reliable as its internal chemistry. I look at these young people standing over slabs of granite, and I see the future of a trade that requires you to be exactly who you say you are. Looking back now, I realized that the most dangerous part of my loneliness wasn't the empty rooms. It was the way it made me willing to accept a counterfeit partnership just to have a warm voice in the kitchen. I had spent decades mastering the physical properties of stone, yet I had completely failed to perform a basic structural check on the people I allowed into my foundation. I let Amanda and Jordan in because I was afraid of the winter, not realizing that they were the very nor'easter I was trying to avoid. It took me years to understand that some people only value your kindness because they see it as a lack of options. They mistake the clinical patience of a craftsman for the passive compliance of a victim. If I'm being honest, I don't hate them. Hate is an emotional expense, and I prefer to keep my ledger balanced. Jordan and Amanda were simply a bad project, a restoration that should have never been attempted on a foundation of lies. The Stone Truth Fund is my way of seeding a different kind of garden. Real justice isn't found in the moment a judge hits a gavel or when a bank account is frozen. Those are just procedural corrections. True justice is the justice of the seed planter. It is the slow, deliberate act of building something beautiful, while the people who tried to destroy you are busy drowning in their own hollow choices. Every morning, I walk into the workshop and hear the rhythmic, steady sound of chisels hitting rock. It is the most honest sound I know. It reminds me that while stone can be cracked, a man's dignity is only broken when he stops defending it. I stand there alone, but the silence no longer feels like a tomb. It feels like a workspace where every unnecessary piece of debris has been cleared away. I have a message for anyone currently standing in a room where their value is being auctioned off for someone else's ease. Do not wait for the structural collapse to believe the warnings. Trust the precision of your own observations over the soft words of those who only show up when you are paying the bill. Setting a boundary isn't an act of war. It is a declaration of value. And if you have to walk away from everyone you once called family to keep your soul intact, remember that the only thing more terrifying than being alone is being surrounded by people who make you feel invisible. My name is Nicholas, and this is the last time I let anyone confuse my kindness with a brittle stone. Have you ever trusted someone who quietly took advantage of your desire for peace? If my journey resonated with you, I would like to hear your perspective on when you finally decided to stop providing for those who didn't respect the source.